Well, thank you for joining us, and obviously we have what can only be described as some very explosive information that raises incredibly questionable practices by the governor and perhaps by Republicans in the legislature as well. What I have to say is that I was stunned this morning to pick up the news and be able to see all of the incredibly damaging potential allegations that we have before us. You know, the thing that I think stands out, and we have it here on our display, you know, because Scott Walker asked, corporate money was given. Because Scott Walker asked, money was funneled to shadowy third-party groups. The second question that it begs is, what did they ask for in return? And it raises so many questions about what they asked for in return and what they might have been provided in return. You know, Wisconsin is a state that I think we all revere for so many different values. But the one that stands out that we have repeatedly said is over in Wisconsin, and that's clean, open, and transparent government. Now we know why they work so mightily to try to make sure the public would never see this information. Now we know why they passed eliminating John Doe's for politicians and corruption, why politicians are given special treatment under the law. Now we know why they worked so hard just before the 4th of July to get rid of open records. Now we know why they don't want a government accountability board made up of nonpartisan judges. Now we know why they passed one of the least transparent campaign finance laws in the country, to such a degree that the respected Brennan Center said that Wisconsin went from having one of the most transparent laws in the country to one of the least transparent laws in the country. And that's what's happening today in Walker's, Wisconsin, is they are doing everything they can possibly do to eliminate clean, open, and transparent government. And now we know why. Now when we see these types of explosive reports, we can tell at least part of what they're trying to hide. Now, we probably still don't know half of the story. I look forward, we just found out hours ago, we've barely been able to comb through just some of the documents. But what we've combed through is extremely troubling. It reminds me what David Stockman said in a different context in the Reagan administration. If it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it looks like a duck, it most likely is a duck. So it's up to Scott Walker to tell us why this isn't a poisoned duck. But he clearly has a lot of explaining to do to the people of Wisconsin with these revelations. And my good colleagues behind me are going to explain some of the more details in the report and why I think every Wisconsinite should be extremely troubled with what we've learned this morning, and why every Wisconsinite should be demanding that we go back to the Wisconsin we always grew up in and we're so proud of, the clean, open, and transparent government of the past, not the Walker's Wisconsin government that over the course of the past session, their major achievements were to make this a less open, less clean, less transparent government. With that having been said, I want to call up our Representative Dana Wachs, who's one of the attorneys in our caucus and practicing trial attorney. Thank you, Representative Wachs.
I guess today, now we know the rest of the story. I grew up in a family of lawyers, and I'm an attorney myself, and I grew up respecting the law, looking at statutes, thinking of the wisdom that went into the statutes and what the law means and should mean. But it appears today that there may not be policy reflected in our laws in this state, at least coming from the Republican side of the aisle. It appears that we have more payback than policy that's being reflected in our statutes. You know, now I think we know why the John Doe bill that came before us and was passed. The Corrupt Politician Protection Act is what we have referred that to, and that bill as being really protective of corrupt politicians. Now we know why that went through, and when it did, and why it did. Now we know why things like the mining bill get passed, and we know why the lead paint bill was passed the way it was, and why 4 words appeared in our budget that would have made the lead paint bill retroactively applied, which the federal courts struck down as not constitutional. So this is a very disappointing day for our state and what politics in this state have come to. I'm the ranking member of Judiciary Committee here, and I hope that at some point in the future, the laws of our state can again reflect policy for people and not payback for powerful special interest groups. Katrina Shanklin.
Next, our Assistant Leader, Katrina Shanklin, who is one of the true environmental champions in the legislature that works so hard to fight against a couple of these bills that now we tend to understand why they push so hard to make sure they pass.
Thank you, Representative Barca. So today, a story unraveled, and I think it will continue to unravel, and it begs a lot of questions. The people of Wisconsin deserve answers. So now we know when Gogebic Taconite, the mining company that donated $700,000 to Republicans and then had a bill passed shortly after, now we know why they donated. It's because Scott Walker asked. Now we know, at least it appears that we know, why in the 2011 legislative session they tried to pass a lead paint bill, and in the 2013-15 budget they passed it through Motion 999. Now we know it's because Scott Walker asked. I don't think it's a coincidence that NL Industries donated $750,000 to Republicans. Now we know that Scott Walker, it appears, was asking on behalf of Club for Growth, a 501c4. Now we know that it appears that he was making asks on behalf of them. We have emails that show that Scott Walker called the 501c4 his C4. We have emails that show that the governor, quote, is encouraging all to invest in the Wisconsin Club for Growth, and they can accept corporate donations, end quote. Now we know this legislative session, we asked repeatedly, we stood over and over and over again in this room, why is it that Republican legislators in the Senate and Assembly, led by Governor Walker in many cases, are spending more time focusing on keeping their jobs and helping themselves with keeping their jobs than on helping their constituents with their jobs? Why is that? Well, now we know. Whether it's blasting open the doors to corporate money in politics and elections, whether it's exempting themselves from political investigations through John Doe investigations, whether it's making the nonpartisan government watchdog into a political lapdog, now we know it certainly appears that this has been an effort by Republicans, and I have a lot of questions. How many Republican legislators in the Senate and Assembly knew about this? How many knew about these emails and knew about the Club for Growth and Scott Walker when they, on a July 4th weekend, right before a holiday, tried to pass and actually successfully passed open records exemptions through the budget? How many of them knew? How many of them talked to the governor? How many more bills passed right before or right after hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations went to the Club for Growth on what appears to be the behest of Scott Walker? We have a lot of questions, and I hope that in the days to come, our questions can be answered. But more than anything, this investigative report released this morning casts considerable doubt on the integrity and character of the governor and his appearance of soliciting donations through a C4 and to a C4 at a time when that was not allowed. There are a lot of questions at play, and I think the Supreme Court campaigns and elections regarding that and the effort of Club for Growth and others to help them too. There's a lot of questions to be had. So if there's one thing that this report does to the people of Wisconsin, it shows them they have less of a voice than the wealthy donors that gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to Club for Growth. It shows them that in Walker's Wisconsin, money speaks. In Walker's Wisconsin, Wealthy corporations from outside and inside our state wrote hundreds of thousands of dollars of checks to Club for Growth, and it certainly appears to benefit the governor, and because the governor asked. That is sad. It shows where our democracy is headed, and when Republican legislators in the Senate and Assembly quietly vote in lockstep to support exempting themselves from John Doe, to support blasting open the doors to corporate contributions, to support making the Government Accountability Board into a partisan entity, it certainly casts a lot of questions about their integrity and what they're willing to do to stay elected. So I sure hope that in the days to come we get more answers. How many Republican legislators knew about this? How many Republican legislators will speak out against it? And how many more people were direct beneficiaries after donating or right before donating to the governor and got bills out of it? I hope that we have answers, but I'll say this, trust in government pivots on and hinges on our ability to maintain integrity and character and make sure that no one speaks for us except our constituents, and today it sure seems like that has gone down the drain. So it's a very disappointing day and a lot more questions to be answered. At this time, we'll take any questions.
Let me just add one more point. Just a couple things that stand out here. That just some of the revelations that we came across, and I'm sure you're all combing through, and it'll be very interesting in the hours and days ahead to learn more about this. But, we have a memo here from S. Walker, Wisconsin, wi@gmail.com, to Carl Rove, talking about RJ is the chief advisor to my campaign. He ran the efforts that defeated the first incumbent Supreme Court justice in decades back in 2008. And Club for Growth, Wisconsin, was the key to retaining Justice Prosser. Incidentally, they did not recuse themselves when they had to discuss this issue that came before them. But then, as Representative Shanklin just alluded to, you look at the big amount of money. Wisconsin is a very different place under Scott Walker than we have been in the past. I mean, big money, corporate dollars that they now have legalized, coordination between campaigns that was illegal when this took place, that now is fully legal. That's part of Walker's Wisconsin. And that's why we can see NL Industries, $750,000. $750,000. A week after the meeting with John Menard, he cut a $1 million check to Club for Growth. $1 million check to Club for Growth. The same day Walker met with Trump, Trump cuts a $15,000 check for Club for Growth. Then it goes on to talk about you should get on a plane immediately and go meet with Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas. That meeting took place. A check came through. We need to find out, we know it's because Scott Walker asked that this money came through to this group that does not have much transparency. We need to find out whether or not there was something delivered in exchange for those inordinate amount of money that just had never been heard of to that scale and that quantity prior to Scott Walker coming in and turning this state upside down and inside out with the most right-wing policies we certainly have seen in modern times. So we're extremely troubled. All Wisconsinites should be troubled. All Wisconsinites should now fully understand why it is that they have passed so many bills to make legal these kinds of things like giving corporate donations, coordinating campaigns, and have less transparency than we've had before. All Wisconsinites should now understand why you have special treatments for politician and John Doe investigations. All Wisconsinites should now understand a good reason why they probably got rid of nonpartisan judges on the GAB. All Wisconsinites should understand now why we have a campaign finance system where Jay Hex went from first to worst in terms of transparency. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
So the courts, though, thus far have found that what was in the John Doe investigation was not illegal. So why do you believe this further is troubling?
Well, first let me say that obviously there's a reason why you have 3 prosecutors in this state that asked the federal courts to look at this. Obviously, that's a dramatic step. They did so at considerable political risk. We saw the money they spent against particularly John Chisholm in Milwaukee. But, you know, I think that they probably had access to these documents that the public didn't. And obviously, they worked mightily to make sure the public would never see these 1,500 pages of material. And now you can understand why. So, obviously, the federal courts, I'm sure, will be reviewing this. We'll find out what their determination is. But clearly, as was stated many times before, we have Supreme Court justices that benefited from the people that stood before them. In the past, they recused themselves. That clearly is what the standard should be in Wisconsin. It's a shame it's not. But I'm glad that we have 3 district attorneys in this state that had the courage of their convictions, that decided to go to the federal court in light of these documents. It's especially obvious why they felt so strongly and why they were willing to do that. I don't know, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that, you know, in the judicial system, historically, judges are to avoid, and litigants, everyone is to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. And so it's very disappointing that some of these justices didn't recuse themselves during this John Doe hearing and decision. I'm cautiously optimistic and hopeful the United States Supreme Court will take this case. I think this kind of case is cornerstone material on the functionality of the republic, to be quite frank. We need to return to policy in this state and elsewhere, not payback for powerful special interest groups.
Any other questions?
So we have a judicial process that's playing out right now. What in the legislature do you think needs to happen in light of some of the information that we've seen?
Well, we need to repeal many of these actions that they've taken. Now that we see part of the reason, maybe the whole reason, why they push to have less clean, open, and transparent government. We need to make sure we have constitutional protections in this state for open records and open meetings. Obviously, we saw our Supreme Court with open meetings say that if the legislature chooses to ignore it, they essentially are repealing the law. That was one of the most ridiculous decisions perhaps I've ever read. But open meetings. The only way we saw that within a very short period of time, it actually passed the Joint Finance Committee to take away, you know, the long-standing traditions we've had to open records. The only way we can guarantee there's not another midnight motion in the next budget is by enshrining in our Constitution those rights that the citizens should have to open records and open meetings. But clearly, there's a stench in this building. And when you pass bills that they've passed on campaign finance to make donations much less obvious, to hide from the public so many different elements of where money's coming from and how it's being spent. When you have people that are passing laws to give special treatment for politicians to be excluded for John Doe, there is a stench surrounding this. And the public should be aware. Clean and open government in Wisconsin is over in Walker's, Wisconsin. And we have to fight mightily to get it back. And I think in this campaign, what we hear in the polling that we're doing, people are paying attention, thank goodness. That's why by nearly 18 points, people feel Wisconsin's going in the wrong direction. And I feel that this November, I'm hoping that we'll have more of these disclosures that come out. We'll learn more of the truth, as Representative Walk said. I'm anxious for that Paul Harvey moment. Now for the rest of the story, because I think there's a lot more to this story we still don't know about. And there's probably many other stories that are waiting to be written to find out, you know, because Scott Walker asked, what were they asking for in return?
Are there bills that you guys have seen over the last five and a half years that you think may have been influenced by donors to the Clifford Guard? Because that's what the Guardian mentioned.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So we already mentioned that there certainly appears to be some kind of connection between the Gogebic Taconite $700,000 donation and the mining bill passing that they admitted the industry wrote, and we only found that out through open records and the John Doe, I believe. And secondly, you know, today we discovered that NL Industries was solicited for a $750,000 donation, and you could argue, would have directly benefited from the lead paint bill if a federal court wouldn't have, I believe they enjoined it. And so those are two examples, and I think it really gives us a lot more questions to ask. How many other bills that we know of could have been influenced? I mean, there are many that we sit in caucus and ask, why in the world are they bringing this up? Where did this come from? And Wisconsin Democracy Campaign does a great job tracking the money, and there certainly appears to be a connection between voucher lobbying, American Federation for Children. You are already seeing them spending a lot of money right now in this election, and then they have all these pro-voucher candidates who come into the legislature, and guess what they do? They work on privatizing our public schools. They work on taking away hundreds of millions of dollars in the next decade from our public school children, from rural schools and urban schools alike, and they divert it to these private, unaccountable voucher schools. So that's another great example of money speaking in Wisconsin. And it's extremely frustrating because the people of Wisconsin overwhelmingly feel as if they don't have a voice. They recognize, they feel that in Wisconsin, money speaks, in Walker's, Wisconsin. And this will give us even more incentive to continue to ask questions and analyze the connection between money and money speaking for Republicans and them passing bills as a result or right before they get the money. So I do think that there's a need for transparency, disclosure, and also, if anything, this begs campaign finance reform. It's time. Money should not have more of a voice than the people, and Democrats have been pushing for campaign finance reform for years and years and years, and will continue to do so, because if anything, this shows how few people get to run this state and how few wealthy special interests, usually from out of our state, get to make the decisions in Wisconsin. It's time for the people of Wisconsin to say, my voice, your voice is more important than big money.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm sure we're gonna have a lot to talk about in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.